Have you ever done everything right? Gave everything you had, and still ended up feeling like a stranger in your own life? I'm 67 years old. I have arthritis in both knees, a garden that needs tending, and a story I've been carrying around for the better part of 3 years now. I used to think keeping quiet was the same as keeping the peace. I don't believe that anymore. My name is Harriet. Wait, no. Let me start over. That's not even my name. I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Lorraine. No. You know what? I'm sorry. Let me just breathe for a second. My name is Edna. Edna Mae Whitfield. And the house I'm about to tell you about. The one I lived in for 31 years. The one where I brought my children home from the hospital, where I buried 2 dogs in the backyard and painted the kitchen yellow, because my late husband, Charles, said yellow kitchens made people feel less alone. That house is gone now. I sold it. On a Tuesday afternoon in March, while my son and his wife were at work, I signed the papers and handed over the keys. And I didn't say a single word to either of them until it was done. People have asked me if I regret it. I tell them the truth. Not for 1 minute. But to understand why, you have to understand what it felt like to live in that house for the last 2 years of my time there. And to understand that, you have to know about my son, my daughter-in-law, and the slow, quiet way a person can be made to feel invisible in the place they love most. Charles and I bought the house in 1991, when our son, Nate, was 4 years old and our daughter, Abigail, had just turned 2. It was a 3-bedroom colonial on Sycamore Drive in Greensboro, North Carolina. Nothing fancy, nothing remarkable, just a good solid house on a street lined with oak trees that dropped acorns every fall and made the squirrels absolutely crazy. We got it for $94,000, which even then was not a lot, but we scraped and saved, and Charles put in overtime at the plant for almost a year to cover the down payment. We fixed it up piece by piece. Charles refinished the hardwood floors himself over one long weekend, and I refinished them again 10 years later, when he threw his back out and couldn't do it anymore. I repainted every room in that house at least twice. The front porch sag, the one that the home inspector mentioned and we figured we'd get to eventually. We finally got to it in 2008, which tells you something about the pace of homeownership when you're also raising 2 kids on 2 modest incomes. But it was ours. Every nail, every coat of paint, every cracked tile we replaced, and every cracked tile we didn't get around to replacing. It was all ours. Charles passed away in November 2019. Pancreatic cancer. He was 63 years old, and he was gone in 4 months from the time they found it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that part, because I could spend the rest of my life on that part and it still wouldn't feel like enough. What I'll say is this. Losing him changed the geometry of everything. The house felt different. Not bad, different, not haunted, just shaped differently. The way a room looks different when you move one piece of furniture. Charles had been the furniture, and now the room was rearranged in a way I hadn't chosen and couldn't undo. I managed. That's what you do. My daughter, Abigail, called every other day from her apartment in Raleigh, and my son, Nate, came by on weekends when he could. I had my neighbor, Francis Dewberry, who had known Charles and me since 1996, and who showed up with soup more times than I can count in those first few months. I had my garden and my books and my routine, and slowly, not all at once, but slowly, I found my footing again. It was about 14 months after Charles passed that Nate called me with what he called an opportunity. He and his wife, Kristin, had been renting an apartment in Durham. They'd been trying to buy a place, but the market had gone completely insane. This was early 2021, when home prices were climbing faster than any of us could make sense of, and they kept getting outbid. Kristin was pregnant with their first child. They needed more space. And Nate had an idea. "Mom," he said, "what if we just moved in with you? Just temporarily, until the market cools down and we can find something. It would only be a year, maybe 18 months at the most. I want to be honest with you. I had a feeling, right then, in the pit of my stomach. Not a specific thought, nothing I could have pointed to and named. Just a feeling, the way sometimes you know it's going to rain before you check the weather. I pushed it down. I told myself it would be fine. I told myself this was what family did. I said yes. Nate and Kristin moved in on a Saturday in March 2021, with a moving truck, 2 cats, and approximately 400 throw pillows. I'm exaggerating about the pillows, but only a little. Kristin had a very specific vision for how a home should look, and it became apparent within the first week that her vision and mine were not the same vision. I want to be fair here because I am trying to tell this story honestly, and not just vent. Kristin was not a monster. She was a 34-year-old woman with good taste, a lot of opinions, and a habit of expressing those opinions in a way that she probably thought was helpful, and I experienced as something else entirely. She would walk through a room and say things like, "You know, if you moved this couch against that wall, it would really open up the space," and then stand there in a way that made it clear she was waiting for me to agree and get up and move the couch. Or she would mention, casually, over dinner, that she'd read somewhere that the color I'd painted the living room, a warm terracotta that Charles and I had chosen together on a rainy afternoon in 2015, was really dated now. She didn't say it to be cruel. I genuinely believe that. But she said it in my house, at my dinner table, about a color I had chosen with my husband who was dead. And I sat there and smiled and said nothing, because I didn't want to make trouble. That was my first mistake. I know that now. The changes came slowly, the way they always do when you're in the middle of them. First, Kristin moved some of my decorative pieces from the mantel, just to make room for a few things, she said. Then a bookshelf in the hallway was rearranged, because the books I'd organized by color weren't really functional. Then the guest bathroom got a makeover while I was visiting Abigail for a long weekend, and I came home to find my old towels in a garbage bag on the back porch, replaced by a set of gray linen towels that cost more than my first car payment. When I mentioned it, gently, I thought, very gently, Kristin said she was sorry. She thought I'd be happy for the upgrade. And she had such a look of genuine surprise on her face that I found myself apologizing to her. For my own towels, Nate, to his credit, or maybe to his discredit, I'm still not sure which, stayed out of it. He worked long hours at his engineering firm, and when he was home he was tired and he loved his wife, and he didn't want conflict. I understood all of that, but understanding something and being okay with it are two different things, and I was starting to become very much not okay. The baby came in August 2021. His name was Theo, and he was the most beautiful thing I had seen since my own children were born, and I loved him immediately and completely and without reservation. Having Theo in the house was genuinely good. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Watching him learn to hold his head up, to smile, to grab at my finger with his whole fist, those were real gifts, and I don't want the rest of this story to make you think I can't see that. But here is what also happened. Once Theo arrived, the dynamic shifted in a way I hadn't anticipated. Kristin was on maternity leave, which meant she was home all day, and being home all day seemed to clarify, for her, that the house was not arranged the way she needed it to be arranged for her family. Not my family, her family. The first real confrontation, though that's probably too strong a word for what it was, because she never raised her voice, and neither did I, came in October, about 2 months after Theo was born. Kristin came to me in the kitchen one morning while I was having my coffee and told me that she and Nate had been thinking, and they thought it would make more sense for them to have the master bedroom. I had been sleeping in the master bedroom for 31 years. I said, "I'm sorry?" She explained it very reasonably. The master had an ensuite bathroom, which would be much more convenient with a newborn. It also had more closet space, which they needed. The room I was in was larger than it needed to be for just one person. She had already spoken to Nate about it, and he thought it made sense. She hoped I understood. I sat there with my coffee mug in both hands, and I looked at the yellow walls, and I thought about Charles standing in the paint store, holding up 2 swatches and saying, "Which one makes you feel less alone?" I said I would think about it. I moved out of the master bedroom 2 weeks later. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself it was practical. I told myself a lot of things that got me through the day without crying, and then I cried anyway. Usually at night, in the smaller bedroom down the hall, which had been Nate's room when he was a teenager, and still had a small dent in the drywall, from the time he threw a textbook across the room during finals week his sophomore year. The 18 months became 2 years. The housing market did not cool down on any schedule. That was convenient for Nate and Kristin. They had stopped actively looking, as far as I could tell. Kristin had gone back to work part-time, and they'd found a daycare for Theo 3 days a week. And life had arranged itself into a rhythm that seemed to work very well for everyone except me. And I had said nothing. I want you to understand that. I had said almost nothing for almost 2 years. I had watched Kristin repaint the living room. She hired a painter, didn't ask me, just scheduled it and told me the week before, and I said nothing. I had watched Nate install a new dishwasher without consulting me, because the old one was too loud, and I said nothing. I had found a box of Charles's things, books and a fishing reel, and a coffee mug from his high school reunion, in the garage, moved from the shelf where I'd kept them. And I had quietly moved them back and said nothing. The thing that finally broke through my silence was so small it should embarrass me. But I've decided to stop being embarrassed about the things that matter. It was a Saturday morning in February. Theo was 18 months old and had started walking. And Kristin had put up a baby gate at the top of the stairs, which made sense. What didn't make sense, or what I couldn't make sense of, anyway, was that she had also rearranged the living room furniture so that the couch now faced away from the window. My window. The window I used to sit at in the mornings with my coffee and watch the oak tree in the front yard. She'd done it while I was at my Tuesday Bible study, and when I came home the couch was facing the television, and the chair I used to sit in was gone entirely. Not gone from the house, just gone from that room. I found it later in the sunroom facing a wall. I asked Kristin about it, casually, the way I always ask things, softly, trying not to cause trouble. She said, "Oh, I know. It's just that Theo keeps trying to climb on the back of the couch when it's near the window. And I was worried about him falling. You understand." And then she smiled at me, and I smiled back, and I went to my room and I sat on the edge of Nate's old bed and I thought, when did I stop existing in this house? I called my daughter that night. Abigail had been worried about me for a while. She'd been dropping hints, asking careful questions every time we talked. The way you do when you know something is wrong, but you don't want to push. When I called her that night, I didn't drop hints. I just told her. All of it. The bedroom. The towels. The couch. The box of her father's things in the garage. Abigail was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Mom, it's your house." "I know," I said. "No," she said. "Mom, it's your house." I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I called Harold Kinsey, who had been my family's attorney since 2003, and who had handled Charles's estate when he passed. Harold was a quiet man, deeply competent, the kind of lawyer who listened more than he talked, which was why I trusted him. I told him I needed to come in. He said, of course, whenever I was ready. What happened at Harold's office was not what I expected. I had called him to ask about my options. Legally, what could I do? What were my rights as the homeowner? And he answered those questions, very clearly and without any drama. It was my home, in my name alone, and I was within my rights to ask my son and daughter-in-law to leave with 30 days written notice. That was straightforward. But then he said there was something else he needed to tell me. He pulled a file from his desk, an older file, manila, a little worn at the edges, and he set it in front of me and said that Charles had added a codicil to his estate plan about 6 months before he was diagnosed. This was before anyone knew anything was wrong. It was just Charles. Being Charles, practical, methodical, always thinking 3 steps ahead. The codicil included a letter. Harold said Charles had asked him to hold it and to use his judgment about when to share it. Harold had been watching and waiting, he said. He thought now was the right time. I opened the letter at Harold's desk, and I read it there, in the gray February light coming through the windows. And I cried in a way I hadn't cried since the week Charles died. He had written, "Edna, if you're reading this, something has gone sideways. You've let someone walk all over you, and you haven't said a word about it because that's who you are. So I'm going to say it for you. That house is yours. We built it together, but I want you to have it, free and clear, and I want you to do whatever you need to do to protect your peace. Don't hang on to it out of obligation. Don't give it up out of guilt. Do what's right for you. You always knew what was right for you. I just need you to remember that. There was more, personal things I'll keep to myself. But that was the heart of it. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I dried my eyes and I asked Harold a few more questions. Practical questions. About the current market in Greensboro. About what a house on Sycamore Drive might sell for now versus what we'd paid for it. About timelines and paperwork and what I would need to do. I drove home and I made dinner and I sat at the table with Nate and Kristin and Theo. And Kristin told me about a new coffee shop that had opened near her office. And Nate talked about a project at work. And I smiled and I nodded and I ate my dinner and I had already made up my mind. I want to say something here because I know what some of you might be thinking. You might be thinking, why didn't you just talk to Nate? Why didn't you just say something? And I understand that question. I asked it to myself many times, especially in those first 2 years. But here's the thing about being silenced slowly. It's not like someone puts tape over your mouth. It's more like, over time, you stop trusting your own voice. You say something small and it gets minimized, and then you say something else and it gets reframed as you being too sensitive. And after a while you start to wonder if you are too sensitive, if your needs are too much, if the peaceful option isn't actually to just be quiet. I had been made to feel, not cruelly but consistently, that my comfort in my own home was a smaller priority than the smooth functioning of my son's family. And I had believed it, for a while. I had let myself believe it. Charles's letter reminded me that I didn't have to. I listed the house on a Thursday. My real estate agent, a woman named Pamela Okafor, who came recommended by Francis Dewberry, told me I could expect significant interest given the neighborhood and the recent improvements. She was diplomatically kind about the renovations Kristin had made, noting that the new paint colors and updated bathrooms would probably help with the sale. The irony of that did not escape me. The house had 3 showings in the first weekend and an offer above asking by the following Tuesday. I signed the papers on a Wednesday morning. I had given Nate and Kristin the required 30 days written notice 2 days before listing. Harold had prepared the notice, formal and legally correct, delivered by certified mail to ensure everything was documented. Nate called me within an hour of receiving it. I remember exactly where I was standing when my phone rang. In the kitchen. By the window over the sink, the one that looks out at the backyard where we'd buried the dogs. The oak tree at the edge of the fence was just starting to bud, the first green of late February, tentative and small. "Mom," Nate said, and I could hear it in his voice. Not anger, not yet, disbelief. "What is this? What does this mean?" "It means what it says," I told him. "I'm selling the house. You have 30 days. There was a silence that lasted a long time. "You can't, Mom, we have a baby. You can't just," he stopped, started again. "Why didn't you talk to me?" And I thought about that question. I thought about it seriously, the way it deserved to be taken seriously, because my son is not a bad person. He had made choices that hurt me, yes. He had allowed things to happen that he should have spoken up about, but he loved me and I loved him, and that had not changed, and I didn't want to be cruel. So I said, "Nate, I tried to talk to you. I tried for 2 years. When I mentioned the bedroom, you told me it made more sense for Kristin to have the ensuite. When I brought up your father's things being moved, you said you'd look into it, and then nothing happened. I stopped trying, because every time I said something, it went nowhere. So now I'm doing something instead." Another silence. "Where will you go?" he asked finally. "I've already figured that out," I said, and I had. Abigail had an in-law suite above her garage that had been sitting empty since she moved to Raleigh. We had talked about it, really talked, for the first time in years, and she had offered it to me the night after I told her everything, without my asking. I would stay there while I figured out what I wanted. A condo, maybe. Something smaller. Something that was mine in a way that nothing felt like it had been mine for the past 2 years. Nate asked if we could talk in person. I said yes. He came over that Sunday, without Kristin, and we sat at the kitchen table. My kitchen table, yellow walls around us. And we had the conversation we should have had 18 months earlier. He cried. I cried. He told me he hadn't realized, really hadn't realized, how far things had gone. And I believe him. Not because I'm naive, but because I know my son. And I know that the particular blindness that love creates is real. When you love someone, and that someone is capable and confident, and usually right, it is very easy to defer, and very easy not to notice what your deference is costing someone else. I told him that. I told him I needed him to understand it, not just for my sake, but for Theo. That little boy was going to watch how his parents treated the people around them, and he was going to learn from it, the way children always do, in ways you can't predict and can't take back. Nate was quiet for a long time after I said that. Then he nodded. Kristin did not take it as well. She called me 2 days after Nate's visit, and her voice was tight and controlled, and she said that she felt blindsided and that she thought we'd all been building something together, and that she was hurt I hadn't come to her directly. I listened. I let her say everything she needed to say, and then I told her as gently as I knew how that this was my home, that I had never stopped it being my home, and that I was sorry if the arrangement had led her to feel otherwise. I did not apologize for selling it. I did not apologize for the 30 days notice. I said I hoped, in time, that we could find our way back to something better, for Theo's sake and for ours. She said she needed time. I said I understood. The movers came on a Friday. Abigail drove up from Raleigh to help me pack, and Francis Dewberry came over with sandwiches and stood in my kitchen one last time, and told me that Charles would be proud. I held myself together until the movers took the last box, and then I stood in the empty living room, the one with the new gray paint where my terracotta used to be, and I let myself cry, fully, the way you have to sometimes, the way holding it in only delays. Then I picked up my purse and walked out the front door and drove away. That was 11 months ago. I'm in Raleigh now, in Abigail's in-law suite, and it's small and it's quiet, and every single thing in it is something I chose. I have my books. I have Charles's fishing reel on the shelf above the desk. I have a little patio where I've started a container garden. Tomatoes, basil, a rosemary bush that is absolutely thriving. Nate and I are speaking again. It was slow at first, careful, the way you move around a bruise. But we're speaking, and we spent Christmas together, and Theo calls me Nana and runs to me with his arms out when I come through the door, and I hold him and I think, this is what I was protecting. Not just myself. The possibility of this, Kristin and I would say, we are politely working on it. There are still hard things between us. I think there will be for a while. But she called me on my birthday in January, which I didn't expect, and she asked about my garden, and I told her about the rosemary. And it was a small thing, but it was something. People ask me what I would do differently. I tell them, I would have spoken sooner. Not louder. Not angrier. Just sooner. The first time I felt invisible in my own home, I would have said so, plainly and without apology, and trusted that my discomfort was worth naming. I waited until I had no voice left before I used the one I had, and that is a lesson I carry with me now. But I also tell them this. It is never too late to act. I was 66 years old when I signed those sale papers. I was 66 years old when I chose myself. And I am here to tell you, from the little patio in Raleigh, where the rosemary is growing taller than I expected, and the mornings are quiet and entirely my own, it was the right thing to do. Charles knew I would figure it out. He always believed that, even when I didn't. I just needed a little reminder, in his handwriting, on a piece of paper he'd left for me in a lawyer's drawer, for the day I was ready to hear it. I think about that a lot. I think about how he knew me well enough to know I would need that. And I think about how the best thing anyone ever did for me was trust me to find my way back to myself, and leave me a letter just in case.